I will introduce Sally, or rather reintroduce Sally, because Sally did her PhD here at Royal Holloway with Amanda Vickery and Jane Hamlet, who's here today. So it's really, really great to have Sally back. And we're following in a bit of tradition because Karen Harvey is also here, and she was another Royal Holloway PhD, and she gave an annual lecture. Was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, Karen? It's quite a long time ago.
I think it was 2018.
Yeah, time flies. So we're delighted to be able to ask back former students and members of the Bedford Centre. And I'm particularly thrilled to be able to ask Sally because of her work on the history of emotions, and I think she is quite well known to a number of you. But for those that may be less familiar, Sally is currently the Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow at Oxford Brookes, and she also is a co-convener of the British History in the Long 18th Century seminar at the Institute of Historical Research, and I know there are quite a few members of that here as well, so welcome to all of you. It's great to see you here. Thank you for coming. I think Sally is probably best known as the author for a very highly praised book entitled The Game of Love in Georgian England, Courtship, Emotions and Material Culture, which came out in 2019. But Sally has also been really busy organising conferences, but also co-editing a special issue of Cultural and Social History entitled Interrogating Romantic Love with Katie Barclay. She's also the co-editor of Feeling Things, Objects and Emotions Through History with Stephanie Downs and Sarah Randalls, that came out in 2018. But this is a new step for Sally. She's just started a new project on the cultural history of Heartbreak, so we are particularly excited, I think, to be one of the earliest or first to hear about it.
So thank you so much for your kind words of introduction and the invitation to give this year's Bedford Centre lecture. I'm so honoured to be asked. I spent so many happy years studying for my PhD at Royal Holloway. So it's just wonderful to be able to come and introduce everyone to my new project. And as you said, this is the first kind of full-length lecture I've given from this project. So I really welcome everybody's feedback, and it'd be really wonderful to kind of hear people's thoughts on the subject, kind of as I'm taking the project forward. And not just from academics too, also, you know, I'd love to hear, I know there's a lot of students here, you know, I do very much welcome your questions, and, you know, please do let me know what you think. I welcome everyone's feedback. So if we could have the first slide, please, Nikki.
Can you see it? Is the title, or do you want the next one?
Next one, please.
Sorry. Oops. Hang on.
There we go. Perfect. So, on the 18th of September, 1706, the gentleman's daughter, Mary Clavering, married the politician and lawyer Lord William Cooper in a secret ceremony. As a widower recently elevated to a barony and Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, he was one of the most eligible men at the English court, whilst she was a toast of the Kit Kat Club who drank to a reigning beauty every year. The couple had an affectionate marriage, with Mary writing to him in 1719, "You are all that is worth living for." However, their union was cut short prematurely when William died unexpectedly following a short illness on the 5th of October, 1723. After her husband's death, Mary's health deteriorated rapidly. Towards the end of December that year, Mary's eldest daughter, Sarah, recorded, "She grew much weaker and extremely ill. She lost her appetite entirely, and at times her memory, so that she would speak of my father as if living, ask for him, and expect him home. When she recollected his death, it seemed with so lively a grief as if it had just happened. In short, she really had what is often talked of, but seen in very few instances, a broken heart." Mary died 4 months after her husband, on the 5th of February, 1724, aged only 39. and she was buried alongside him in St Mary's Church, Hartingford. So today I'm going to discuss kind of, what does it mean to possess a broken heart? If you can have the next slide, please. So today, the Oxford English Dictionary defines heartbreak as overwhelming, unbearable, or intense sorrow or emotional distress, especially as a result of bereavement or the end of a romantic relationship. In 1755, Samuel Johnson's Landmark Dictionary defined heartbreak as overpowering sorrow. Following Johnson's lexicon, a person that began heart whole with an unimpaired heart might find themselves heart wounded once filled with the passion of love and end up heartbroken once overpowered by grief. Others, such as the novelist Goethe, use the death of the feeling heart to powerfully embody loss of love. As the protagonist of his 1774 novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, wrote, he once had a heart to embrace the whole world in love. That heart is dead now, leaving nothing but a fearful gap in his breast. Physicians believed that extremes of emotion had the power to agitate, paralyze, or destroy the heart. As the influential French physician Jean-Nicolas Corvisart wrote, the heart was the point in which the effects of all the moral affections, gay or melancholy, seemed to be concentrated. No moral affection can be experienced without the acceleration, diminution, or derangement of the motion of the heart. Let its power be increased, paralyzed, or destroyed. Pleasure, pain, fear, anger, all the sensible affections, in fact, make it palpitate or suspend its action. Hence, the overpowering grief of losing a lover was concentrated in the heart itself, disturbing its motion and potentially causing it to stop altogether. So this lecture today explores the embodied experience of losing love in 18th and 19th century Britain. It stems from my new research project on the subject, which is provisionally titled Dead Love, Heartbreak, Emotions and Embodiment in Britain, circa 1720 to 1850. If we could have the next slide, Nikki. So the title of the project is taken from the pre-Raphaelite artist and writer Elizabeth Siddal's poem on the fickleness and transience of earthly love, which closes, "This is only earth, my dear, where true love is not given." In Siddal's account, love is always short-lived and can only truly be found in heaven. So my first book, The Game of Love in Georgian England, explored the making and breaking of courtships in words and objects. And this new project moves from the beginning to the end of love, to consider the deleterious and potentially fatal effects of lost love in both medicine and popular culture. So whilst my first book focused particularly on courtship, my second examines love lost in a range of different circumstances, whether romantic rejection, the enforced separation of a couple, or the death of a suitor or spouse. The project focuses on the years from circa 1720 to 1850, a key period of change in how passions such as love and grief were understood, experienced, and valued by men and women. It aligns very roughly with the rise and fall of the cult of sensibility between circa 1720 and 1790, and the Romantic movement between roughly 1770 and 1850. These two overlapping cultural movements fundamentally reshaped how society valued particular emotions, how they were experienced by gendered bodies, how individuals understood the power of love and grief, and the embodied consequences of excessive feeling. The research is situated at the nexus of emotions history, the history of medicine, and cultural history. It draws upon a wide range of sources, including letters, autobiographies, medical treatises, bills of mortality, periodicals, novels, plays, poems, paintings, and prints, to rediscover the nature, physiology, popular understanding, and evolution of lost or dead love in history. So I've cast my net deliberately very wide, as one of the difficulties of kind of analysing what happens when love is gone is that very often the sources have all gone too. So if you could get the next slide, please, Nikki. So I couldn't resist a reference to Friends. So there's an episode in the first season of the American sitcom Friends that I hope many of you will have seen. So Rachel, Phoebe and Monica stage a boyfriend bonfire. And the bonfire acts as a cleansing ritual where they burn things associated with old boyfriends, including letters, photographs and receipts from dinners. And they end up setting fire to their apartment in the end, because Rachel pours a bottle of Paolo's leftover grappa onto the fire. So the scene, I mean, it isn't as far removed from reality as you might think. So in 1812, Lady Caroline Lamb staged a bonfire to burn letters and tokens from her lover, Lord Byron, while a group of young girls that she'd gathered together danced around it, dressed in white, reciting curses. And she also had her page read out a poem about throwing the trinkets of love onto the flames that she'd composed specially for the occasion. It turned out, though, that the bonfire was purely symbolic. So she'd had a replica of his miniature made in advance, ready to burn, and she copied out all of his letters because she couldn't bear to part with the originals. The burning of remnants from old relationships was widespread, though typically much more mundane. Burning objects work to destroy material evidence of a match and protect a woman's reputation, and provide a cleansing ritual to erase painful memories and enable individuals to start over again. Have the next slide, please. So others threw mementos from failed romantic relationships into rivers in order for the water to carry them away. And this is a ritual, again, with a very long history. So Shakespeare's narrative poem, A Lover's Complaint, describes a forsaken young woman removing romantic favours from a basket, tearing or breaking them apart, bathing them in her tears, and tossing them into a river, meeting wet with wet. And a similar scene is depicted in Francis Danby's oil painting shown here, called Disappointed Love, which shows a young woman sitting by a riverbank crying, holding her face in her hands. And she's been reading letters from her lover and looking at his miniature, which lie on the grass next to her. And then in front of her, the river is carrying away torn up scraps of his letters. There's also plentiful material evidence of people tossing love tokens into rivers, whether to bring luck to a fledgling relationship or rid themselves of the unwanted debris of a failed match. And so the bent and engraved coins shown here on the right were recovered by mudlarks who comb the Thames foreshore looking for historical treasures. So some people threw old tokens into the water to get rid of them, whereas equally this was also a ritual that some people did to bring their relationship luck. So you don't know whether the people were throwing these into the river to bless a match or to get rid of things that they no longer wanted, as a kind of painful reminder of love, or love lost, I should say. So it's by combining these fragments of evidence from relationships with representations in wider culture that I hope to start to build a picture of the changing social, cultural, physical and emotional character of lost love over the longue durée. Have the next slide, please. So in the last 5 decades, a great deal of research had scrutinised the search for love and the making of relationships, both in my own work and in the work of Lawrence Stone, John Gillis, Amanda Vickery, Helen Berry, Elizabeth Foister, Naomi Tadmore and Katie Barclay, among many, many others. But a lot less attention has been paid to the flip side of not winning but losing love. And if we can have the next slide. There are, of course, studies of breach of promise, marriage breakdown, separation and divorce, such as Stone's Road to Divorce and Broken Lives, shown here, Roderick Phillips's Untying the Knot, and Joan Beggiato's Unquiet Lives. But approaching the subject from the vantage point of emotions and embodiment provides a completely new lens through which to view love that was unfulfilled, unreturned, unsuccessful, or simply undone. Recent work by the sociologist Eva Illouz and literary scholar Kirsten Pearl has examined the meaning of what they call unloving. To unlove means to unmake an intimate relationship, to stop loving somebody and get back your heart. Illouz locates the era starting in the second half of the 18th century as a key period in the history of unloving, where industrialization and new understandings of love as freedom disrupted traditional social bonds and allowed people greater license to unlove as they saw fit. Pearl presents unloving as a central preoccupation of 19th century fiction, as exemplified by Marianne's turmoil following her desertion by Willoughby in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and Anne Elliot's vain attempts to extinguish her love for Captain Wentworth in Persuasion. While Marianne's successful unloving restores her agency and enables her to bestow her affections somewhere more fitting upon the Honourable Colonel Brandon, Anne's failure to unlove alienates her from her family, who remain insensible to her plight. Her struggle also takes an immense physical toll, and she finds herself wretchedly altered since she and Frederick first met, whilst her family observe that she has become faded and thin. These studies have revealed the significance of not just making intimate relationships, but of dissolving them too. Have the next slide, please. So diverse scholars of emotions and embodiment, including Karen Harvey, Kirsty Blair, Faye Bound-Alberti, Erin Sullivan, Hannah Newton, Carolyn Day, and Joanne Beggiato, have explored how emotions were experienced by, understood through, and interpreted using the body. By the 18th century, the older humoral tradition had been supplanted by a mechanistic understanding of the human body, characterized not by the careful balance of fluids, but by spirits which flowed through the nerves and fibres. Bound-Alberti has charted an important cultural shift between the later 17th and early 20th centuries, from a cardiocentric body that was focused on the heart to a craniocentric one that is organized around the brain. And so by 1835, the German neuroanatomist Francis Gall could confidently declare that the brain is the source of all feelings, ideas, affections, and passions. Their manifestations, therefore, must depend on the brain and be modified by it. Nonetheless, with the ascendancy of the brain and mind sciences, feelings still remained firmly corporeal in nature, with violent feelings thought to agitate and even kill the heart. Furthermore, as Kirsty Blair has shown, the displacement of the heart as the central agent within the body led to an efflorescence of poetry and literature concerning the heart in Victorian culture, and a new focus on ailments such as heart disease, which were associated with emotional sensitivity and gendered as feminine complaints. Scholars such as Carolyn Day have connected emotional misery with specific ailments. And so in her fantastic book, Consumptive Chic, Day has traced a clear causal relationship between disappointment in love and consumption in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which particularly was seen to affect women of the upper classes due to their perceived indolent and inactive lifestyles. And so she focuses particularly on Maria Siddons, who died in 1803, shortly after her fiancé, the artist Thomas Lawrence, embarked on an affair with her sister Sally. So Maria placed the blame for her illness firmly at his feet, writing, "He has been my death," because of this kind of emotional betrayal, while other people in the family entreated the painter to master his passions in order to spare any further casualties. Next slide, please. Scientific studies increasingly indicate that it is indeed possible to suffer from a broken heart. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, or stress-induced cardiomyopathy, was first identified in Japan in 1990 and is popularly known as broken heart syndrome. So cardio means heart, myo is muscle, and pathy is suffering or disease. That's cardiomyopathy. It's caused by a massive surge of stress hormones after a traumatic event such as the death of a loved one. Such emotional distress stuns the heart muscle, causing similar symptoms to a heart attack, including chest pains and shortness of breath. It derives its name from the takotsubo pots used by Japanese fishermen to trap octopuses, which are similar in shape to the broken heart, with a narrow neck and ballooning left ventricle. And this is what you can see in the illustration on your screen. So the disease affects up to 2,500 people in the UK every year, typically women over the age of 50. So up to 90% of patients suffering from broken heart syndrome are female. And it's not entirely clear why yet, although some have speculated that it's linked to the decline of estrogen in menopause, which leaves the heart more vulnerable to stress, or to gendered variations in the heart and arteries, which determine how they respond to acute stress. Most sufferers go on to make a complete recovery, though it can prove fatal in the event of complications such as heart failure. Can we have the next slide, please, Nikki? So in this project, then, I'm asking, what happened when love was extinguished, thwarted, or lost? How did love, sadness, and romantic pain act on both the mind and body? What was the role and relative importance of the heart, brain, nerves, and soul? How was heartbreak experienced differently by men and women? How did they attempt to recover from their loss, and with what success? And finally, what can these discourses reveal about emotions, embodiment, and the meaning of love itself? So next slide. The breakdown of the relationship between the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft and the soldier and land speculator Gilbert Imlay provides a valuable case study through which we can begin to answer some of these questions. The couple met in Paris in April 1793 and embarked on a passionate love affair that summer. In 1794, they moved in together, and Gilbert registered Mary as his wife at the American embassy in order to provide her with some measure of diplomatic protection amidst the upheaval of revolution. She gave birth to their daughter Frances in May and began to sign off her letters as Mrs. Imlay. However, soon after, Gilbert travelled to London on business and started to evade her. Suspecting that his affection had gone cold, Mary became convinced that she would die from sorrow, writing to Gilbert, "My heart is not only broken, but my constitution destroyed." In April 1795, she joined him in London to discover that he had embarked on an affair with a young actress, and his explanations for his behaviour only added to the anguish of a heart already overwhelmed in grief. As William Godwin later put it in his memoir, her frantic efforts to repair their relationship continually added fuel to the fire that destroyed her. She formed a desperate purpose to die. Mary resolved to end her life by taking a fatal dose of laudanum, but was either deterred or saved by Gilbert. Only a week later, she then travelled to Scandinavia with their daughter Fanny in tow to try and recover a lost shipment of silver on his behalf. On the 7th of July, 1795, she wrote to him from Strömstad on the northwest coast of Sweden. This is on the next slide. It says, "There are misfortunes so great as to silence the usual expressions of sorrow. Believe me, there is such a thing as a broken heart. There are characters whose very energy preys upon them, and who, ever inclined to cherish by reflection some passion, cannot rest satisfied with the common comforts of life. I've endeavoured to fly from myself and launched into all the dissipation possible here, only to feel keener anguish when alone with my child. Still, could anything please me, had not disappointment cut me off from life, this romantic country, these fine evenings would interest me. My God, can anything? And am I ever to feel alive only to painful sensations?" She did find some benefit in the change of scenery, the pleasures of fellow feeling, and the kindness and generosity extended by her Swedish hosts. The purity of the Nordic air and the long light summer evenings also helps to revive her. Her constitution was renovated by days passed outdoors, roaming the countryside, drinking water direct from the stream, learning how to row on the ocean, riding on horseback, and even sleeping outside in the fields. She indulged in a pleasing forgetfulness and revived some of her hopes for life, writing, "Surely something resides in this heart that is not perishable." In the peace of her solitude, she managed to soothe her fractious soul and hoped that she had turned over a new page in the history of my own heart. However, it was not to last. On her return to London, she discovered that Gilbert had taken up with a second mistress and made another suicide attempt by soaking her clothes in the rain, wrapping them tightly around herself to help her sink, and throwing herself off Putney Bridge. After jumping from the bridge, she fell unconscious and drifted downstream before being pulled out of the river by fishermen, taken to a nearby inn and revived. Wollstonecraft's experience of heartbreak wasn't a single moment or event, but a protracted ordeal characterized by devastating sorrow. A broken heart here was a heart gradually overcome and eventually stopped by extreme sadness. Love and sadness had long been thought to place particular strain upon the heart. As Erin Sullivan has shown, during the 17th century, extreme and unrelenting grief was thought to attract cold, heavy, melancholic blood to the heart, which was then converted into more melancholy, slowly withering and chilling the body. When individuals who had died from grief were opened up for autopsies, their hearts were found to be so shriveled that all that was left was a piece of dry skin, like leaves withered in the autumn. With greater focus on nervous maladies during the 18th century, anatomists such as the Italian professor Giovanni Battista Morgagni argued that the nerves were commonly disturbed by certain passions of the mind, causing the motion of the heart to be greatly diminished and even interrupted. Suffering from very great sadness could cause all kinds of irregularities in the pulse, which only returned to normal when the nerves were brought back to their former disposition. Such disorders could plague both men and women, though women were seen to be especially vulnerable due to the inherent delicacy and sensitivity of their nerves, which were thought to predispose them to extremes of emotion. Precisely how these emotional extremes were manifest in the body was the central concern of the pseudoscience of physiognomy. If we can see the next slide, please, Nikki. So the popularization of physiognomy was roughly contemporaneous with the culture of sensibility, which was also concerned with physical displays of feelings such as blushing, sighing, trembling, swooning, and weeping. Physiognomists theorized how exactly emotions were embodied, prioritizing the corporeal above all else. As the French court painter shown here, Charles Le Brun, put it, the force and power of the passions could not be well understood or demonstrated, but by a figure. Le Brun first developed his theories of physiognomy in his letters to the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris, which were introduced to England in 1701. Following Descartes, Le Brun argued that the entire body was linked to the soul, which operated through the pineal gland in the centre of the brain, that's shown in your illustration on the slide. Anything that caused a passion in the soul would prompt the brain to send spirits to the nerve, which would then move the muscles to produce an action in the body. Whichever muscle received the most spirits would move the most, and whichever received the least spirits would appear flaccid and shrunk. And so it followed that every part of a person's body therefore betrayed their emotional state, especially the face. And so physiognomists try to deduce a person's character and emotional disposition from the movement of their eyebrows, the appearance of their nose, and particularly the shape of their mouth, which was thought to indicate the movements of the heart. These physical traits were inherently gendered, with women's fibres and organs seen as more naturally tender and easily wounded than men's. And so their perceived anatomical differences were seen to predispose women to further differences of intellect, character, and morality. So for physiognomists, you can see anatomy was destiny. The Swiss writer, theologian, and physiognomist Johann Caspar Lavater set it up as a series of oppositions, where a man was hard and rough, a woman was soft and smooth. Where a man was mostly angular, a woman was mostly round. Where a man would remain silent, a woman would weep. When a man felt anguish, a woman would despair. In other words, he said, women feel more. So we can have the next slide, please. So sorrow in particular was understood as a disagreeable languor of the soul, which weakened and slowed the pulse and made it feel as if there were cords tightening around the heart. A heartbroken individual who found themselves consumed by sorrow would have lowered and swollen eyelids, the nostrils drawn down, the mouth slightly open with the corners sinking down, and the head negligently leaning to one shoulder, as shown in the illustration on the right. So similar traits were evident in the experience of other so-called negative emotions, such as pain, where the eyebrows sloped up in the centre of the brow and down at the sides, and weeping, which also saw the mouth sloping downwards at the corners. And if we can have the next slide. So some of these features identified by physiognomists as characteristics of kind of heartbreak and sorrow and sad emotions are very much evident in William Hogarth's portrait of Sigismunda, mourning over the heart of her dead lover, Giscardo, from 1759. So the scene is taken from Boccaccio's Decameron, which was retold by John Dryden in his Fables, Ancient and Modern, in 1700. In the tale, the young widow Sigismunda has been forbidden from remarrying by her jealous and possessive father, Prince Tancred. When Tancred discovers his daughter cavorting with his page Giscardo, he has him murdered and encloses his heart in a golden goblet, which he then presents to Sigismunda, and that's what she's holding in this painting. And so in Hogarth's scene, you can see her lips are slightly parted with the corners drawn down, with her eyebrows sloping down at the sides in order to convey her intense grief. So the sinking of her face literally embodies the sinking of her heart, with the passions drawing her entire body downward. The state of the passions was further revealed by the shape of a person's muscles, the tautness of their skin, and the movement of their body. So if we can see the next slide, Nikki. This is a drawing it's a preparatory sketch for the English translation of Lavater's landmark work, Essays on Physiognomy, and it shows a woman weeping over her dead lover. She's thrown herself across him to bury her head in his chest. Her right arm is outstretched, with the tension in her muscles across her shoulders and her back conveying her distress. So the more violent the emotion, the more clearly it was thought to be apparent in the body by distending or enlarging the muscles. So physiognomy had always attracted critics for lacking nuance, for being overly prescriptive in fixing how the passions had to look, and for failing to account for differences in character. And by the end of the 18th century, many discredited it in favour of more scientific anatomical investigations. Nonetheless, its widespread influence on European visual and literary culture lingered right into the mid-19th century, providing an enormously influential model for determining the key physical characteristics of the heartbroken body. While physiognomists endeavoured to classify emotional states through muscles and movement, others sought to capture them in poetry and prose. 18th century literature was populated with men and women suffering the emotional and physical trauma of losing love. On the 31st of July 1718, a young couple from Oxfordshire called John Hewitt and Sarah Drew were tragically killed by lightning whilst taking in the annual harvest, and they were found hiding beneath a smoking heap of barley. John had been blackened all over, and his body was wrapped around Sarah's in a futile effort to protect her. News of their tragic story moved the poets Alexander Pope and John Gay, who wrote an epitaph for their tomb, and James Thomson, who adapted the tale in his celebrated poem The Seasons, published in 1727. But in his poem, he allowed the man to live, and he only killed off the woman. So if we could have the next slide, please, Nikki. So in Thomson's poem, the young lovers Celadon and Amelia are caught in a summer storm. And so Amelia is the one who gets struck by lightning, and she falls dead at her lover's feet in a heap of pallid ashes. Celadon survives, but is struck by severe amazement, hating life, speechless and fixed in all the death of woe. And he subsequently stands over her tomb, wordlessly pining for her, forever silent and forever sad. In the stillness and silence of his loss, fixed as if made from marble, Celadon comes to resemble the dead himself. So the tale inspired a whole raft of moral essays, paintings, prints, sculptures, and decorative objects depicting the tragic lovers. So the statue shown here on the left is by the academician John Charles Felix Rossi, and it literally casts the couple in marble, capturing the moment that they are struck by the bolt of lightning. And then on the right is a sketch by the Scottish artist Alexander Runciman, depicting Amelia lying dead in Celadon's arms, limp, with her head fallen back and her mouth open. Celadon has curled himself around her, and like the bereaved woman in the previous image, is resting his head on her heart. Celadon's constancy was used as an exemplar of eternal devotion in the century's best-selling novel of lost love, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Julie, or The New Heloise, that was published in 1761. In the tale, the young Julie d'Etanges is contracted to marry her father's Russian friend de Walmart, but instead she falls in love with her Swiss tutor, St. Preux. After the couple give in to their passions and share a fatal kiss, as shown in the engraving here on the right, Julie insists that they have to separate. They've gone too far, they have to take some time apart, and so she sends him away travelling through the mountains of the Valais. And so she writes to him, "The time for happiness has passed like a lightning flash. The time for trials is just beginning, with nothing to help me tell when it will end. I was cultivating hope and see it withering every day. What use is it, alas, to water the leaves when the tree is felled at the base? I sense, my friends, that the weight of absence is crushing me. Everything I perceive brings me some idea of your presence to warn me that I have lost you." And so for Rousseau's Julie, it's the unrelenting nature of her suffering that makes it so unbearable, believing that the soul bears sharp pains more easily than prolonged sadness. And in the end, it proves too much for her, and her cousin Claire is forced to recall St. Preux in order to rescue Julie from death. The novel provides a powerful dramatisation of the physical ramifications of thwarted love and what exactly follows love's end. Julie wrote that for two people so consumed by the heat of their love, the slightest cooling would soon become the languor of death. An invincible distaste, a perpetual tedium would follow the extinction of love, and we would scarcely survive long. And so love has extinguished all of their other passions to become inseparable from life itself. And it appears that Julie does eventually conquer her passion. And she writes to St. Preux after a gap of 7 years with an account of how she put an end to love and describes their former love as dead. And yet her final letter of the novel reveals that she had been unable to fully cure herself of it, as her love for St. Preux had been crystallized in her heart all along. The extreme sorrow caused by losing love was clearly an unbearable torment. Yet the final act in this drama of love also had an important function in keeping a couple emotionally bound together. If we could have the next slide, Nikki. So Rousseau writes, while mourning the person we cherished, we are still attached to the object of our suffering through the suffering itself. And this condition is less awful than being attached to nothing at all. Hence, the protracted suffering associated with the death of love at least enabled individuals to cling on to that which they had previously possessed. In some accounts, unfulfilled love could provide an opportunity for personal growth and spiritual awakening. So if we could have the next slide. The story of Constantia and Theodosius was first published by Joseph Addison in The Spectator in 1711. The young couple fell in love, but were forbidden from seeing each other after a quarrel broke out between their parents. After Constantia's father contracted her to marry another man, Theodosius fled and became a monk, calling himself Father Francis. She believed that he committed suicide and resolved to become a nun. He became renowned for his piety, leading her to seek him out for confession. But with his long beard, his shaven head, and his religious habits, she didn't recognize him. Upon finally revealing his identity, he wrote to her that the love we have had for one another will make us more happy in its disappointment than it could have done in its success. Providence has disposed of us for our advantage, though not according to our wishes. So rather than the couple eventually being united and finding their love fulfilled, she weeps with joy and resolves, it is enough. Theodosius is still in being. I shall live with comfort and die in peace. And so they're eventually buried at the end of the story, side by side. Multiple editions of their letters were published, purportedly found in the nunnery where Constantia resided. And the pair provided an idealized model for accepting loss of love through religious application, and was celebrated in visual culture for at least a century after the story's initial publication. And in this frontispiece to the story shown here, you can see Constantia looking to her crucifix and asking, do I owe this piece to you? But rather, her serenity following her thwarted relationship comes from her quiet conscience and her unburdened mind. Next slide, please. So whilst Constantia and Theodosius provided a fictionalized model for unfulfilled love, other texts were rooted in real experiences. Mary Hayes published her semi-autobiographical novel, Memoirs of Emma Courtney, in 1796, based on her passionate attachment to the Cambridge mathematician and philosopher and radical Unitarian writer William Friend. The story contained verbatim excerpts from their letters, in addition to those from her confidant William Godwin. Hayes was deeply unusual in both keeping her letters and going one step further to publish them in novelistic form, with herself cast as the heroine, Emma Courtney, and Friend as her beloved Augustus Harley. So Hayes and Friend had first begun corresponding in 1792 after he wrote to her expressing his admiration. And the pair embarked on an on-again, off-again romance that she hoped was going to end in marriage. But sadly, the intensity of her love was not reciprocated, with Friend deterred by her lack of fortune. So their relationship first concluded in 1796, after which she published Emma Courtney. They then started their romance again later, but it ended for good upon his marriage to Sarah Blackburn, who was the granddaughter of the Archdeacon Francis Blackburn in 1808. And so he told Hayes about his marriage by letter. And it took her years to recover from the shock, especially as he'd always told her that he lacked the means to support a wife, and that was why he could never marry her. And so according to her friends, she was never able to regain her composure of mind. And it was only 4 years later, by around 1812, that she seemed more like herself again. They found her extremely forgiving in acquitting friend as much as she did, given he had married purely for social advancement, quote, without a heart to dispose of. So Hayes struggled to overcome her loss in the absence of suitably fulfilling activities for the female mind, finding herself hemmed in on every side by the constitutions of society. Women were thought to suffer more acutely from romantic hurt, with those of a more elevated social status particularly vulnerable due to their sedentary lifestyles and soft and feeling constitutions. Their nervous sensitivity, physical delicacy, and susceptibility to feeling both exacerbated their suffering and underscored their refinement. As Hayes wrote, the insipid routine of female gentility was woefully insufficient to engross, to fill up the active, aspiring mind. Men, on the other hand, were thought to be able to stifle love more easily than women. They were advised by conduct writers to avoid excessive whining about their romantic misfortunes and demonstrate their self-control. So the ideal was for them to employ themselves suitably and throw themselves into other pursuits in order to protect their pride. So suicide with a pistol provided a means of escape for those who were unable to conform to the ideal. As memorialised in Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, where the hero shoots himself at the end with 2 pistols, and Hayes condemned for tincturing the minds of its readers with gloomy and desponding ideas. Hayes believed that whilst her heart had been pierced through by her trauma, it was not broken. Rather, she was wearied with her misery, forced to live with a festering wound caused by the barbed arrow in her breast. She sought to recover by seeking out company and conversation, writing, "My desolate heart looks round for support." But she found it extremely difficult to be around contented couples when she was disbarred from enjoying the same happiness herself. Mary Hayes was serially unlucky in love, having already endured the death of her fiancé, John Eccles, during her youth, believing at the time that all of her happiness had been buried with him. After her hopes were crushed again once again a decade later, she believed, "It is certain that could I have gained the end proposed, i.e. marriage, my happiness would have been increased." And she quoted from Wollstonecraft's letters from Sweden in arguing, "It is necessary for me to love and admire, or I sink into sadness." For Hayes, as for her heroine Emma Courtney, happiness was, quote, "the only desirable end of existence," a happiness that was very much bound up with matrimony. Yet she repeatedly found herself both wretched and unhappy. In this conflating of love and happiness and heartbreak and sadness, we can see how the nature of romantic hurt changed according to the meaning and valuation given to love at particular moments in time. So we can have the next slide. So over the course of the 18th century, love was increasingly associated with happiness, which found its ultimate expression in marriage and bearing children. As one man called Roger Horncastle wrote to his fiancée Dorothy in the first half of the century, after being forced to postpone their wedding due to sickness, he wrote, "I'm extremely concerned to think how much I shall disappoint you this morning, for I make no question but you had very much set your heart upon that happy marriage we engaged to consummate this day. I thought my happiness so secure that it was not in the power of ill fate to deprive me of it." So this happiness wasn't something that people kind of looked forward to securing in eternity, but was something that could be secured by them here on earth during their life. And that was through marriage. And so this print, Happiness, you can see here, is from 1798. It shows a happily married couple, and the husband looks down at his smiling wife, who has their child sitting on their knee. And it's captioned, "Happy they live by Hymen blessed, the God of love their vows caressed." In this context, to lose love was therefore to lose the prospect of marriage and a happy, comfortable and contented life. During the Romantic era from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, love was seen as complete unity between two selves. So in loving another person, you were investing part of yourself in them, literally dividing the soul in two. We have the next slide. So this drew on the Platonic idea that all humans had another half, with only love able to bring these two halves together and make one out of two. As Aristophanes argued in Plato's Symposium, love is the name for our pursuit of wholeness, for our desire to be complete. And so this made individuals especially vulnerable when a relationship came to an end, as they had lost their other half or part of their own self. This idea reached its apotheosis in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, published in 1847, where Cathy argues that if she dies, she will still live on inside Heathcliff.
She sort of derives.
Hello.
There'll be.
And he retorts that in breaking her heart by marrying Edgar Linton, she'd also broken his. And what kind of life could he possibly have with his soul in the grave? And so then at the end of the novel, Cathy's broken heart has fated her to madness and death. In some cases, then, unfulfilled love and the violent extremes of emotion it involved could pave the path to insanity. In his autobiography, Early Days, the weaver and radical writer Samuel Bamford described a beautiful but proud local woman who had rejected a young dragoon stationed nearby in Bury. She was the daughter of a propertied farmer and had been insulted by the idea of loving a common soldier. The soldier was left hopeless in a deplorable state of mind, leaving with his regiment in a forlorn state. He continued to write to her, and eventually she reconsidered and sought him out in Scotland. But on her arrival, she was met with his funeral procession, causing her to fall from her horse in shock. Thereafter, she was, quote, an altered woman, a faded rose, lost in her heart, lost in mind, a dream interpreter, a spell solver, a religious monomaniac, an object of pity and in some degree dread to all who knew her. She lived out her days wandering from place to place, wrapped in an old brown cloak, with sundry rags, bags and pockets swinging about her. And this missed opportunity to fulfill her love left her perpetually seeking rest, but finding none. Many men and women in the same state found themselves admitted to the asylums, which grew rapidly in number over the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In 1811, the physician William Black listed the primary causes of madness among his patients at the Bethlem Hospital in Southwark. Among the top 6 causes of insanity were 2 emotional states, love and grief, with 206 cases, or 24%, brought on by grief, and 74 cases, 9%, caused by love. And together, the two accounted for 1/3 of all patients. The diagnosis and treatment of the resulting ailments such as erotomania, hysteria, melancholia, and monomania reveal how physicians saw emotions as acting upon the body and mind and the defining characteristics of violent passions. As the forensic psychiatrist Alexander Morrison wrote in his Physiognomy of Mental Diseases, both love and grief were mental as well as physical affections, able to excite a person's imagination, unhinge their reason, and lead to delirium. The extreme grief of losing love could also lead to a number of other potentially life-threatening conditions, such as cancer and tuberculosis. The French physician René Laennec published his landmark treatise on diseases of the chest and mediate auscultation in 1819. And so that's the new term that he coined for listening to the body using his new invention, the stethoscope. Laennec's treatise features patients whose conditions had arisen after violent grief, which caused loss of physical strength, loss of appetite and sleep, progressing to more serious symptoms such as vomiting and diarrhea, and the development of tumours. In addition to very deep grief, being forced to endure depressing passions for long periods of time could also lead to diseases of the lungs, such as phthisis, another name for tuberculosis. Some physicians even described a distinct class of phthisis called phthisis and melancholia for tuberculosis, which arose as a result of melancholy and also made patients more liable to insanity. So, in conclusion, this project aims to unravel the manifold social, cultural, medical, and emotional implications of losing love in 18th and 19th century Britain. Just as finding love was reified as an all-important social ideal, its end or conclusion was just as ubiquitous, if not more so, in the everyday experiences of men and women. For every story of love and matrimony, there is an equivalent tale of heartbreak and loss, at once involving anguish, disappointment, sadness, despair, and pain. Some found that their love, once offered, was not returned, while others were forced to terminate extramarital affairs or lost suitors or spouses to an early grave. Studying the end of these relationships, what I'm calling dead love, can shed new light on the embodied experience of emotion, from full or palpitating hearts to agonized feelings and the complete loss of reason or self-control. It provides a new way of approaching emotion, not as something underway or in process, but rather as something that ends prematurely, which disappears or has gone. It's not love I'm necessarily concerned with, but its absence or departure. If we can have the next slide, please, Nikki. As Elizabeth Siddal put it, love here is dead. And so in her poem, she continued, then harbour no smile on your bonny face to win the deepest sigh. The fairest words on truest lips pass on and surely die. And you will stand alone, my dear, when wintry winds draw nigh. And so in approaching intimate relationships from this vantage point, we must start at the end. Thank you.
Okay, I think that brings a really fantastic session to an end. So it only remains for me to thank everybody for coming, but more than anything, to thank Sally for such a wonderful lecture. It was fascinating and I think generated an excellent discussion. Thank you, Sally.